So, you know what's really fun? I had this video planned right at the start of February, and then through a combination of personal stuff and having to work on Eurovision reviews, this video kind of got delayed. If I'd done it when I was supposed to, when I'd originally planned to do it, everything would have turned out just fine and there wouldn't be any issues, but since then, NitroRad went and did a video about this very same game, just completely out of nowhere, and now it looks like I'm copying him! Well, rest assured, I'm not. I have had this video planned for a while, and in fact, I quite deliberately have not watched his video on this game, so that I don't accidentally absorb any of his thoughts into this video. I intend to, because he's good, and you really should check him and that particular video and his whole channel out, but it's not as if he needs my support. If anything, I need his support. But I'm getting quite a ways off topic here, so anyway, let's get on with my video about Anodyne. Roll the opening titles. Well, howdy ho, you lovely people. I am Tessellating Hexagons, and today I shall be discussing one of the games that actually made me want to start doing gameplay content on YouTube in the first place, Anodyne. The thing is, in hindsight, maybe I was a little bit too enthusiastic in playing the game, because I don't think my original Let's Play of the game did it anywhere near the justice it deserves, because, I mean, hell, there was one episode of that I accidentally recorded whilst on a marijuana contact high because of a former roommate of mine, but that's a story for another time. I suppose that begs the question then, what's the story for this time, if that gets pushed off to one side? Well, as ever, let's open with the fast facts, as we always do. For one, when Anodyne was first developed, the two lead developers, Sean Hantani and Marina Kitaka, simply used their own names in the credits of the game, but then Anodyne's successes led to them adopting the name Analgesic Productions. You know, since analgesic and anodyne kind of sort of mean the same thing, they refer to substances that reduce pain. So there's something to mentally chew upon, I suppose.
He says, knowing damn well that you don't chew painkillers.
Anyway, the game first saw a release on the PC, later finding success through Humble Bundle, the Pirate Bay, and finally Steam, and has since garnered enough of a cult following to lead to the game seeing further releases on the Xbox One, PS4, and in the near future, as of the time of recording this video, even the Nintendo Switch. Beyond that, there's even a sequel in the works, slated for release in the second quarter of 2019, so something went dangerously right with this game. Now, ordinarily, I would go into painstaking amounts of detail over when the game was released and on what platform and in what order and when, but honestly, the only dates I'm 100% sure of are its original release on the 4th of February 2013 and its planned Switch release on the 28th of February 2019. Everything in between I am disgustingly hazy on. And true, I could just hop over to the official Analgesic Productions Discord server, not a sponsor, they're just super nice and humble, and ask the developers to their faces, but social anxiety is one hell of a drug. Moving on. So, what's the game all about then? Well, in terms of what's actually given to you for certain, you don't get much to go on, and I mean that in a good way, an artsy way. We play as a white-haired chap by the name of Young, who's told by the Elder that he must travel the land to protect the Briar from the darkness. I'm not exaggerating here, those are the actual names used in-game. Ordinarily, you might expect that to set the game up to have a really tongue-in-cheek sense of Rick and Morty-ish humour, intending to deconstruct the tropes of a top-down Zelda-like game in a manner similar to what Undertale, amongst others, did for RPGs, but actually it's more like an early warning of the game's cynical, almost nihilistic outlook on the world. Who cares what you're doing or why you're doing it? That's not going to stop you from doing it now, is it? So, let's begin by taking a look at the raw gameplay. As I already alluded to, it's often compared to the 2D Legend of Zelda games, especially the likes of Link's Awakening and the two Oracle games, and in that regard, I guess that is fairly accurate. We take on a top-down perspective in a 2D environment and explore an interconnected but not quite Metroidvania-style overworld, taking on dungeons, battling monsters, and generally saving the day. But it's not all similarities, it's certainly not a plagiarism of the formula. For one, Young's weapon of choice isn't a sword, but a broom. True, it still functions like a sword when it comes to combat, but it also has the added ability to pick up and move piles of dust, which sounds kind of rubbish on paper, I admit, but it's used to such great effect in practice. In fact, it's kind of surprising just how much mileage the game design gets out of such a simple mechanic. Even setting aside the other functions of the broom, including a rather deliberately game-breaking ability you receive right at the very end, the dust alone can be used as a means of traversing otherwise hazardous water, covering up fire jets, powering elevator platform things, redirecting monsters so that they run into switches for you, and probably even more besides that I can't remember off the top of my head. One thing Anodyne does have in common with the Zelda games, meanwhile, is the health system, but only insofar as enemies hitting you causes you to lose health. Health is measured in units at the top of the screen, and you can extend your health meter permanently either by beating bosses or by finding extra heart containers at the end of optional extra puzzles scattered throughout the game, for a finite total of 16 when all is said and done if you go out of your way to get every single one. Similarly though, if you go far enough out of your way in the overworld, and in dungeons for that matter, you'll come across these trading card looking things squirreled away in chests that show a picture of a monster or a character or some other entity, and if you check them in the menu, they have a quote or a thought written on them. To that end, they're kind of just decoration collectibles, but you will need to get as many of them as possible, it doesn't matter which ones, just keep your numbers up in order to beat the game. And if memory serves, you won't run into enough to progress if you just go on the shortest required path to and through every level. I suppose that really merits praise then. Between those cards, the health upgrades, and the hidden broom power-ups, not to mention the secret extra items found using the secret ability you gain in the post-game, this game really rewards exploration. Which is good because the vast majority of the game's world building and storytelling is done through player inference, rather than direct exposition. And so, if you go out of your way to find these bonuses, you'll become more intimately acquainted with, and thus hopefully more fond of, the world of the game, because that world has no plans to hold your hand in letting you get to know it. For just one example, you may run into signposts scattered throughout the overworld. If you check them though, each and every one of them will be, quote, too faded to read, so the onus here is entirely on you. And that's the situation we're playing with. Take Young, use the broom, collect cards, and power through a series of dungeons to save the land. The first 3 dungeons each yield a coloured key, which then helps you unlock shortcuts and new areas within the overworld, as well as the windmill area once you have all 3, which, although small, has one of the best music tracks in the entire game, features the most melancholy card quote of all, and, most crucially, hides a secret button that, when pressed, moves those weird statue sculpture thingies you've been seeing at the end of each dungeon, allowing you to progress even deeper into the land. And that's when the second phase of the game opens up. 3 more dungeons emerge, and you can tackle those in any order at all. At this point, really, your main goal is to build up health if you think you need it, and to expand your card collection so that you can head through the rather expensive gate on the northern end of the main Hyrule Field-esque hub area. To say any more than that would be spoilerific, so I'll leave it there. One quick side note though. You'll rather frequently run into these warp stone things that take you back to the Nexus, which is sort of like a meta hub area that allows you to warp directly to certain areas of the game. What makes for a really nice touch though, is that a pinky red indicator thing will light up above each warp gate once you find every card that's hidden in that area. So that really helps when it comes time to clean up in anticipation of the endgame. Hold the phone though, now give the phone to me. Endgame? What's actually going on here? Well, I'll try not to spoil too much, but I suppose I ought to go into a bit more detail about the plot itself. Upon starting the game, we're first greeted by a chap who calls himself the Village Elder, though a reliable source tells us fairly early on that there is no village, and he's not exactly eld, never mind elder. Still, with that cynical sense of impatience that pervades the edges of the atmosphere of the entire game, he sends us on our way to find our destined weapon with which we'll save the land from the darkness. And upon being introduced to the warping mechanics, we're thrust off into the land proper. After a brief tutorial and the random appearance of a zombie ghost thing that never gets an explanation, we run into a girl by the name of Mitra. Mitra? I've never been sure on the pronunciation. In any case, her upbeat personality demarcates her as one of the very, very few friendly entities that we encounter on our journey, as very few other characters actually talk, and of those that do, only Mitra and the Elder actually recur. Everything else is pretty much incidental. Anyway, we show the Elder our broom, and he pretends to be impressed, before allowing us to just get on with our journey. We take on the first dungeon, meet and defeat the first boss, and never really give a second thought as to whether or not that first boss's speeches before and after the fight actually have a higher meaning or not. And that's the pattern of the story. Because every other entity in the game is so hands-off and unsociable, it's not as if each area or each dungeon or whatever has a massive plot arc attached to it, like they do in Zelda games. It's not as if there's no story whatsoever in each area, though, either. We do get a lot of implicit storytelling from place to place surrounding, for instance, the life cycle of the creatures from the Red Caves, or the rise and fall of the circus, or the weird side area that you could skip right past if you wanted to, which serves as a bizarre allegory for the internet, of all things. In the grand scheme of things, though, the mini-plot of each little area is deliberately sort of pushed to the back of your experience because of that same overarching idea that, well, who cares what the local problem is? You're gonna power through and solve it anyway, even if you only do so because that's a necessary step on the way to your personal goal of saving the Briar. You don't care what the local problem is. You're not a local. It isn't your problem. But in discussing that subtext, I'm getting a little bit far ahead of myself. Anyway, once you've beaten all of the dungeons and head up to that expensive card gate I mentioned earlier, the Elder emerges full of doubt that Young is even ready to advance to the endgame area, and changes the price on the gate to an impossibly high number, that is, more cards than there are in the game, and passes it off as us having misread the sign all along. Despite this, we're still able to open the gate with the initial value, because he may have changed the sign, but the cost remains the same, and there's some implication that the gates are sentient anyway. As an act of desperation, he fights Young head-on, determined to stop him for his own good. Of course, this plan fails, and Young is able to proceed to this strange garden area that's all cold and depressive on one side, and fiery and manic on the other, and the whole fire and ice motif pervades right the way up to the final boss at the end of the area. But saying anything more on that front would just be plain old rude and spoilery. At this point, though, it should be absolutely beyond abundantly clear that you shouldn't just be reading the game at just face value and nothing else. There may have been hints here and there over the course of what you've experienced in the game, but at this point, by the time you've hit the end game, it should be so painfully clear that things are not quite what they seem. The thing is, to an extent, quite what that higher meaning actually is left open to the interpretation of the player, to such an extent that you could argue that there is no higher meaning, but not that it doesn't not mean, like, the higher meaning is that there is no higher meaning, it's just abstract symbolism. Well, the developers have gone on record to state that the game is pretty abstract on purpose, but it does build on genuine ideas, fears, and experiences, which I suppose makes it feel all the more real. For one, I won't spoil the ending itself, but it gives the impression that the entirety of the land is just a representation of Young's internalized self. It's his internal world, and the final boss isn't who we think it is, it's an embodiment of Young's fears of how that person might react if they were to choose to abandon him, and defeating that boss shows us that the real person, or the most realistic version of that person, is much more forgiving. We defeated Young's fears of that person, not the person themselves, but, as I said before, social anxiety is one hell of a drug. There are other themes that are mentioned that play into this symbolism quite beautifully too. For instance, the snowmen on the cold side of the endgame area only speak in intrusive, self-loathing thoughts. The wall boss at the end of the cliff dungeon constantly misnames Young and mischaracterizes his life and his interests at the end of a dungeon full of muttering, unyielding crowds that only serve to get in the way without a single care about Young's duties. And the whole area of Youngtown, which replaces Young's broom with a dagger, and while the town is full of NPCs, trying to talk to any of them just results in Young stabbing them to death, though their corpses can still be spoken to as if nothing happened, and so we see the dichotomy of the fear of I only ever hurt anyone I come into contact with versus the reality of no matter how bad I feel about the interaction, they don't seem any worse for wear. So the long and short of it is, no matter how you choose to read into it, Young seems like a deeply troubled individual and honestly big mood. That would be a rather sad note to conclude on, but it doesn't quite end there. Yes, there's the tumultuous relationship between Young's fears and the reality of any given situation, whether that's the victims of Youngtown, or the cutscene that includes the line, let's go and get a sandwich or something. You know the bit I mean if you've played the game before. But while all of this is going on, there is something else important to remember here. Young is armed with a broom. Think about that. Think about what that symbolizes. All this time, he's not just been battling his inner demons, he's not just been trying to stab them in the throat to get them to shut up or something like that. He's been cleaning up his internal world. Not just the monsters, but the internal cobwebs, the dust, all that stuff. He's not just overcoming his inner fears, he's cleaning them away, categorizing them, tidying them up, making them be done with. And every part of that, from beating monsters with the broom, to solving puzzles by using the broom to move dust around or whatever, it's a really beautiful analogy in my most humble of opinions. And so, I suppose, that just raises the question of the Elder and Mitra. I insist that it's fully open to your interpretation, but in my opinion, the Elder represents Young's depression, inner doubts, and rational mind, so to speak, that characterizes all of his negativity, whilst at the same time prodding him, reminding him that he has to do something about it, whilst simultaneously guilt-tripping him over not having finished it already, and for not having started on it sooner. Mitra, meanwhile, is a bit more of a complicated case. Given how she first appears in the story out of seemingly nowhere, I'm inclined to interpret her as an unexpected outside influence in Young's real-world life, whether that's in the form of antidepressants, or, in my interpretation, a new, or otherwise third-party, friend who can help Young through his tough times whilst remaining completely impartial to the central drama between Young and the Briar. As for whether Mitra, as she appears in-game, is the actual influence of this third party, or just Young's compassionate mind taking her likeness, I leave up to your interpretation. Either way though, that's a lot to unpack. And so, with all of that hanging in the air, it just falls to me to give the game a grade, as I always do. Some reviewers love this game for its soundtrack, its art style, symbolism, gameplay, and goodness knows what else, and others are critical of how detached, surreal, and abstract it can all be at times, especially because some of that abstractness can be so much so that it doesn't have to mean anything and you still get the same experience out of it. I explained this much better early on in the video. But personally, I think it earns a rank A for quite a few reasons. Obviously, there's the deep, higher meaning stuff that I just discussed that, even at its least obscure, if you're willing to invest yourself in it, it provokes plenty of thought. The fact that the art style is evocative of nostalgic memories of the 16-bit era, helped, I admit, by the fact that I did grow up on the Sega Mega Drive, but that's neither here nor there, and the fact that the soundtrack is so downright gorgeous, just pushes all of that appeal even further. As it happens, there's only one possible criticism I could even begin to have with this game, that being this jump right here in the circus dungeon. But as of relatively recently, Analgesic Productions released a patch for the game, changing it so that falling into pits no longer deals any damage whatsoever, so this jump now becomes a fair challenge rather than a source of frustration. Good grief, these developers can do no wrong, I swear. And that, dear friends, is pretty much it. I can't really think of anything else to say here other than maybe do consider checking out the Analgesic Productions Discord server, because it is full of lovely people, and the developers are always there and always just as lovely and always happy to hear feedback on their work. And, of course, I need to deliver my usual outro anyway, beginning with thanking my own lovely people over on patreon.com/TessHex, as always. As ever, they get to see these videos ad-free a whole month before they hit YouTube, no matter how delayed they end up being, and they get other perks as well that suitably reflect their generosity. If you see anything there that you like, be it that, or access to the patrons-only channel on my Discord server, which is available for as little as $1 per video, or anything else, feel quite free to join them. Everyone's welcome. More information in the video description and the video iCard, of course. In the meantime, though, I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons, and, well, I hope that you're as hyped as I am for Anodyne 2, which is coming out very soon. If it's anything like its predecessor, it should be pretty excellent, and I've seen some development stuff of it. It looks pretty excellent. But that's going to have to wait for a Patreon review of its own. For now, though, I shall see you when next I see you. Ta-ta for now.